Okay, good evening, everybody. Many thanks for coming on a very wet evening. It's our great delight to welcome David Marquand and his wife Judith Marquand to Cardiff University. I can't possibly do justice to David Marquand's CV, so I'm not going to try. Other than to say, on a rough count, I'm probably wrong here, that this book that he's launching this evening, Mammon's Kingdom, I think is his 15th book.
But really? Can't be true, surely.
It's in that ballpark, so we won't quibble over a couple of books. But I think this, I counted 14 before this one, and as I say, I can't possibly do justice to it. Although Kenneth O. Morgan put it very well, I think, when he said that David Marquand was the nearest thing that the UK had produced to a Renaissance man. He'd been a leader writer, a Labour MP, a Eurocrat, an Oxford Don, and over and above all that, he'd been a premier public intellectual on the centre-left of British political thinking. And that's a major achievement, it seems to me. But of course, when I first encountered Marquand, it wasn't son, it was father, because not many people know that his father, Hilary Marquand, taught economics at Cardiff University, and in 1936 published one of the great books of the interwar depression, a book called South Wales Needs a Plan. And which we're still waiting. We're still waiting for it, of course. Maybe we'll hear something this evening. But it was one of my favourite books as a PhD student at Sussex. And it's still used today. And at the heart of that book is a plea for the towns of the coast to be better connected with the coalfield communities. And at the heart of that strategy, he said, was the need for better connectivity to enable people to travel easily north and south, west and east. And we need a regional-wide body to deliver better connectivity. I almost thought he was talking about the new metro. It just shows you that current advocates are standing on the shoulders of giants. And I had to mention that book because it's a major book that stood the test of time. So the format this evening, other than welcoming David and hearing him talk about the book and the implications, is also to welcome Richard Wynne-Jones, who heads up our Wales Governance Centre, because this evening is sponsored by Cardiff University, the Governance Centre, and by the Institute of Welsh Affairs. And Lee Waters, the director of the Institute of Welsh Affairs, is with us this evening. So, without further ado, will you join me, please, in welcoming David Marquand?
Shall I go? Right. Well, Kevin, that's wonderful introduction. I think you must have been counting a lot of rather dubious books of mine, of sort of edited books, which don't really count. I put them in the front cover here, but you shouldn't have counted them, because I really can't make it to be 15. But anyway, it's nice to be flattered, even if the flattery is untrue. In fact, it's even better if it's untrue. I was so moved by your mention of my father. Of course, my father taught in this very university all through the 30s, as you said. And indeed, I think I have very dim childhood memories of coming to it as a small boy. I don't know if any of the learning rubbed off on me, and maybe the whole thing is a myth anyway, but I seem to remember that. Maybe, can I mention another slightly more distant ancestor of mine, which is the other side of the family, Ebenezer Rees. Ebenezer Rees was born in the coalfield, went down the pit at the age of 8, was blacklisted for trying to form a union, emigrated to America, as many Welsh miners did, of course, and somewhere or other, somehow or other, he learnt printing, became a printer, and then came back to his roots in Ystalyfera, in the Swansea Valley, and founded the first socialist newspaper in Wales, which was called Slavir. And I've even read some of the very, very early copies, and this was really red-blooded socialism, by God. It would make Tony Benn seem like a pale pink liberal. Anyway, it is so nice to be here and so moving that you've talked about my father, but I think perhaps I'd better move on. Though, as you say, South Wales still needs a plan. I hadn't thought of that. What am I trying to do in this book? It's now had an awful lot of reviews, and they've puzzled and confused me, actually. Sometimes I think they must have read a different book from the one that I wrote. But what I'm not trying to do is write a manifesto. This is not intended to be a sort of plan for government. I'm not really putting forward concrete policies. And some critics have said, why on earth haven't I? What I'm calling for is what I call a national conversation involving all the main traditions of our culture, political and indeed religious and cultural as well, with the aim of fashioning what I call a new public philosophy. And I'm calling for what I call a wake-up call to a nation sleepwalking towards a seedy barbarism. Now, critics, especially from what I might call the conventional left, have objected to this idea. What the hell is the point, they say, of some sort of vague, nebulous national conversation? What are we messing about with new public philosophies and all of this kind of stuff? What we want is what the Labour view of politics has always stood for, really. What you do if you want to change society is you put forward a manifesto, you win power on the basis of that manifesto, you then push through the points that you put to the electorate in the election, you push those through Parliament, and bingo, that's what you've done. You've changed society. Well, the model, of course, is based on the most successful Labour government, sometimes I think the only truly successful Labour government that we've ever had in the UK, namely the Attlee government of 1945 to 51, in which, by the way, my father was a minister. But, of course, the changes that were carried out by the Attlee government followed a century-long debate, discussion, national conversation, if you will, about what Thomas Carlyle called the condition of England question. Of course, he didn't only mean England, he really meant Britain. He was actually a Scot, so why he should have been talking about England, I don't know. But the public philosophy that made Labour's election victory in 1945 possible and provided the basis for its reforming programme owed as much to liberals like Keynes, John Maynard Keynes and William Beveridge, and indeed to maverick conservatives like Harold Macmillan, who wrote a fascinating book in the 30s, The Middle Way, calling for planning. He wasn't only interested in planning for South Wales, he wanted planning for everything. And I think myself, the truth is that lasting changes can't be, so to speak, forced down the throat of society by a government sitting in Whitehall and with a majority in Westminster alone. The changes that last have to be accepted by the people of the country, not just in terms of a sort of passive acquiescence, but support, active support. And the 45 Labour government did achieve that, didn't lose, for example, a single by-election throughout the whole 6 years that it was in power, despite severe austerity and lots of social problems that make those that we face now look rather simple. Why have I written the book? Why write at all? I mean, books are bloody difficult things to write. Why do I spend my declining years sitting in front of a computer looking up things on the internet and typing away? Well, the thing that really spurred me to do it was that I was astonished, amazed, as I still am in retrospect, by the response to the crisis of 2007 to 2008. This was, after all, the second most devastating crisis in the whole long history of capitalism, only surpassed by the crisis that started with the Wall Street crash in 1929 and went on through the 1930s. But the crisis of that time, the crisis of the 30s, led political leaders in the United States, in Germany, and even to some degree in this country, to jettison the orthodoxy of what had been the recent past and to embrace new approaches. Now, the approaches adopted in Nazi Germany were not very attractive. And so it's worth remembering that new approaches can sometimes be malign as well as benign. But it was certainly new approaches. Nothing comparable has happened this time. No modern-day Roosevelt has called on his countrymen to drive the money changers from the temple. No 21st century Lloyd George has called for a New Deal for Britain. There is, at the moment, a nominally socialist government in France, but it's pretty pale stuff compared to the program of Léon Blum's Popular Front government in the 1930s. On left and right alike, it seems to me, political leaders are searching for a cleaned up version of business as usual and a return to the pre-crash march towards the sunlit uplands of ever-increasing material prosperity, the illusory, imaginary sunlit uplands, in my view. And despite talk of tough times and hard choices, the institutions and the culture and the assumptions that helped to produce the crash are still riding high. One obvious example is the frenetic house price bubble in London, in the southeast of England, which has now got so frenetic that not noticeably left-wing figures like Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, and Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, and indeed the European Commission, headed by the Portuguese conservative José Manuel Barroso, have all said, God, you've got to damp this down. You can't go on like this. You're heading for another crash. And it's not the only example. Another one which I find peculiarly, I don't know how to, disquieting, is the charge by Margaret Hodge, a very excellent political figure in my view, the chair of the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, which is the body that's supposed to look at the expenditure of public money and make sure that it's being spent properly, who says that Lazards, who were the government's advisor on the flotation of Royal Mail shares when Royal Mail was privatised, they advised the government on what should be the price. And they were paid a substantial sum of money, well over £1 million, for their advice. When the flotation took place, they were able to buy the shares at 330 pence a share, and later, not very much later, sold them at 470 pence a share. This is really not very nice, is it? This isn't how we should be behaving. On a deeper level, the growth of inequality and the social ills associated with it the humiliating isolation of those at the bottom of the economic pile and the callous indifference of those at the top, the penetration of state institutions by corporate power, and the steady attrition of the public realm. All of these, the stigmata of pre-crisis Britain, loom as large as they did before 2008. Well, I say in the last sentence of the book, we can't go on as we are. Now, a lot of critics have said, oh yes, we can. We like things the way they are. Equality is for the birds. So what if those at the bottom of the social pile are humiliated? The poor have failed to take advantage of the opportunities that the freed up market of our day have created for them. They've brought their poverty on themselves. Boring old farts like David Marquand, immersed in a golden glow of nostalgia for a vanished past, belong on the dust heap of history. Quite a number of reviews in the right-wing press have said that, more or less. They haven't used the word boring old fart, but that's clearly what they mean. Now, I want to try to persuade you that boring old farts on the dustbin of history may actually have, or at least this one, may actually have got some good ideas. And I want particularly to look at the whole question of what I call the public realm, because I think that the decline, the colonization of the public realm by what I call a market state has been the single most appalling feature of the last 20 years of our history, 30 years rather. What do I mean by the public realm? Well, I see it as the realm of service, equity, professional and public duty, as opposed both to the market realm of buying and selling and to the private realm of love, family, and friendship. Fundamental to it, I believe, is the assumption that the public interest is more than just a bundle of private interests. I think it is rooted in a conviction, instinctive conviction, hauntingly expressed in John Donne's wonderful phrase, "No man is an island. Send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." That we are all members one of another. The public realm, looked at in this way, is sustained by a very complex structure of duties and rights. The rights include the human rights promulgated in declarations like the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the European Convention of Human Rights that appeared 2 days later. These human rights include, among many other things, the right to life, prohibition of torture and slavery, the right to a free trial, a fair trial, the right to freedom of expression and association, and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But these are not the only rights that sustain the public realm of this country and indeed other countries. Supplementing them are more specifically British rights, such as the right to strike, the right to free healthcare. Well, I'm not sure if we still have that right, but we did used to. The right to equal pay for equal work, the right to free primary and secondary education. Most of these rights, British rights, have got analogues in other countries, of course, but that doesn't detract from their British origins. And we should not think that they somehow emerged peacefully from the womb of philosophical or legal argument. They were secured by political action and debate. rights presuppose duties. And Nora O'Neill, one of the people who've influenced my thinking most, actually, in writing this book, philosopher, former president of the British Academy, among other things, she argues, and I think she's right, that duties are logically and morally prior to rights. Active citizens who meet their duties, she writes, thereby secure one another's rights. If citizens are too passive, too self-indulgent to perform their duties, talk of rights will be so much hot air. In his inaugural address as president, John F. Kennedy famously urged his fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I think that could serve as a maxim for the public realm. It is a gift of history, precious but also vulnerable. Now, the boundaries of the public realm are often hazy. There's a lot of dispute about the exact nature of the rights that it enshrines, and so on. But I think it is impossible to imagine a civilized society, or indeed a genuinely free market, without a public realm. The private ties of family and friendship are, of course, fundamental to human life, and so are the exchanges of the market realm. Adam Smith was perfectly right when he said truck, barter, and exchange is fundamental to human beings, certainly. But without a robust and confident public realm to complement them, the private and market realms are likely to become nests of predators preying on those who lack private influence or market power. The Sicilian mafia is an example of one. Of the first, the mortgage salesman from Northern Rock, who persuaded credulous, poor, ill-informed people to take out mortgages that they couldn't afford, are an example, perhaps, of the second. Now, I think we have seen in the last 30 years, beginning under Margaret Thatcher, but I'm sorry to say continued under the successor governments of, first John Major, and then Tony Blair, and then Gordon Brown, and now Cameron and Clegg, we have seen a continued assault on the public realm in this sense from government. I just pick out one or two examples. One of the great achievements of the 19th century creators of the public realm, of whom Gladstone was an important member, was the creation of a professional bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, a civil service that was recruited on merit, admittedly from a very narrow social class, but was recruited on merit through examinations, tested in examinations, instead of patronage and nepotism. Those were the so-called Northcote-Trevelyan report, which presaged those reforms which were carried through into practice by Gladstone. The course of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century, and indeed continuing right through, certainly till the crisis of the 1970s, saw all kinds of increases, a number of different aspects of continued growth of the public realm. One of them was the growth of professionalism, professions committed to certain values of equity and service, as well, of course, as making a decent living, and sometimes they betrayed their trust. Of course, they were human beings. But still, in principle, there was a professional ethic which told you how to behave, and that was a fundamental part, in my judgment, of the public realm. Another feature of the public realm was local government, very strong and powerful local governments. This city would be an example. And the great cities in the north of England were examples too. They pioneered what was sometimes called gas and water socialism. So it wasn't just the central state, it wasn't even mainly the central state. It was local governments as well. And I think the trade unions played a crucial part too in establishing this public realm. They didn't just stand, as Samuel Gompers famously said, the American trade union leader famously said, when he asked what he stood for, he said, more. Well, I suppose in some ways a rather good answer, but if you're a trade union negotiator. But the British trade union movement was not just for more. It was also for a better kind of society, and it was for a better kind of society achieved through a strong and vibrant public realm. Now, what happened under the governments of the last 30 years, it seems to me, has been an absolutely, how can words fail me actually, almost a remorseless attack on all of these constituents of the public realm. The Thatcher government clearly loathed the whole idea of a public realm. She disagreed passionately with John Donne's idea expressed in the statement about, send not to know for whom the bell tolls. She didn't think we were members of one of another. On the contrary, she thought, and she didn't think, that there could be or should be a sort of third realm in addition to the market realm and the private realm. On the contrary, she said, famously, as we all know, there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals and their families. Well, that philosophy, under her, led to a massive, consistent and devastating attack on local government, which continued thereafter. The Blair and Brown governments were no more friendly to local government than the Thatcher government was. I am staggered now. Some of my best friends in the part of Oxford where I live, and Judith too, are local councillors. And they do an amazingly good job. They have virtually no power, and they're not out in it for the beer. They're trying to do something for the people of their area with virtually no instruments to hand. And I think it's miraculous that there should be such people. But their freedom of action has been steadily whittled away. One of the greatest achievements, of course, of the early part of the second half of the 20th century was the creation of the National Health Service. There's a wonderful book, deeply depressing actually, by my old professor at Sussex. You might have known him, called Colin Lees. Do you remember him? Colin Lees and somebody called Stuart Player have written a book called The Plot Against the NHS. And they demonstrate, I think, absolutely convincingly, that starting around about the turn of the 20th and 21st century, around about the year 2000 or so, there was a quite deliberate and self-conscious desire on the part of a key group of ministers and advisors in the relevant departments, particularly the Department of Health, to marketize the health service. And that was, of course, taken very much further under the present government with Lansley's legislation. The extraordinary, it actually almost makes you laugh, the extraordinary farce which is now going on between this row between the charming and innocent Michael Gove and the horrible lady Theresa May about these wicked schools in Birmingham. This, you know, I mean, the point about all this is Gove's desire to turn every school into an academy. No control, no relationship whatever. I mean, the local government's responsibility for education was steadily whittled away, of course, under both Blair and Brown. But Gove's, it's lunacy. It's absolute lunacy. It's impossible to conceive that a Department of Education sitting in London is going to be ultimately responsible for every single school in the entire country. It used to be said that the French Minister of Education knew what every school child in France was studying at every moment of the day. But I mean, the French centralisation is nothing compared to this. So this is what's happened. Now, is there any hope of getting back? I suppose that's the question we have to ask ourselves. One of the people who reviewed my book said the theme is very clear. What David Marquand is saying is that we're going to hell in a handcart. And he disagrees. We're not going to hell. According to him, we're not going to hell in a handcart. But actually, I'm not saying that. It's very funny, you know, if you publish a book which is sort of slightly complicated, it's very interesting the way that reviewers will pick out some of the things you said in the first 2 or 3 chapters, but they never get to the end. And maybe it's just as well. Maybe it's my fault. But actually, in the last chapter, I point to a number of sort of counteractions that are going on in our society as we speak. The Occupy movement, the movement for a living wage in London and over the whole country, Citizens UK, the internet campaigning group, 38 Degrees, and the Avaz, the other one. I mean, there is within society the green movement above all, which is calling for a fundamental change, not just in the political economy, but in the moral economy of this country. All of these exist, and what we have to do, I think, what I'm trying in a modest way to contribute to doing, is to knit together the aspirations of these, sometimes of these different groups, who don't always speak to each other, to knit these together into a coherent new public philosophy. I've got 3 giants of the past that I want to draw on, representing our major traditions. One is Edmund Burke, one is John Stuart Mill, and one is R.H. Tawney. I want to read you one quotation from Tawney, because I think it's great stuff, really great stuff. Where does he say it? Here somewhere. Yes, he wrote a fierce letter to the New Statesman protesting against the Labour chief whip's acceptance of a knighthood from the Tory-dominated national government. And he asked, he said, has the Labour Party jettisoned its belief in social equality? And then he goes on, well, does it suppose that it will convert the public to a belief in equality if it does not in its heart believe in it itself? And does it expect to persuade them of the genuineness of its convictions if prominent members of the party sit up like poodles in a drawing room, wag their tails when patted, and lick their lips at the social sugar plums tossed them by their masters? It has declared that it is committed to an uncompromising struggle with plutocracy and all its works. Then why stick in its hair the very feathers which the plutocracy, in its more imbecile moments, loves to wear in its own. And he ends up with what the whole basis of the system that he's protesting against stinks of the servile respect for wealth and social position, which remains even today the characteristic and contemptible vice of large numbers of our fellow citizens. Nobody reviewing the book has picked that up. I wish they would, because that actually, I think, Tawny's got a lot to say to the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Richard's now going to offer a response, and then we'll open up for comment and questions. Thanks, Rich.
You should read this book. It's a relatively slim volume. There's lots of white in there. But it takes on some of the biggest, most fundamental questions of our time. It's erudite, elegantly written, urgent, engaging, witty. Even when you disagree with its analysis of prescriptions, you're forced to think harder about your own views. It's a book which stimulates your brain, and you should read it. Now, in being asked to respond to it, there's a big temptation just to read chunks out, actually, or to cite some of the really striking and sometimes eye-watering statistics about the growth of inequality, for example, that you've collated together. But it's actually, it's a book which is not only a call to arms for a revived social democracy, it's also, as you've heard, a call to dialogue. So I think it's more in the spirit of the book to respond constructively, perhaps critically, to some of it. So let's start with David's analysis of our current travails. The core concern of the book, and I was pleased that I got this right at least, is the undermining of the public realm in Britain. Public realm understood both in terms of institutions and values by unbridled turbo-capitalism. So let me quote from the book directly. Towards the end of the book, you'll be pleased to hear, where you précis your own arguments. The culture of untamed capitalism strikes at the heart of the public realm. The market's realm's invasion of the public realm has helped to procure rising levels of inequality and falling levels of public trust. Declining trust undermines the norms and culture of democracy and makes it easier for an oligarchic elite to extract rents from the rest of us. Holding the system together is a culture of hedonistic individualism. The result is that we no longer have a common language in which to reflect on our predicament and hammer out a solution. The air is loud with anger, but the angry and those they are angry with talk past each other. Now, this is stirring stuff, and in my view, profoundly true, except, that is, when David digs deeper into this concept of hedonistic individualism. It's quite an important concept in the argument, because he argues this underpins this current system. Now, hedonistic individualism, on my reading, which may well be mistaken, has two components, one of which is market individualism. So it's Hayek, it's monetarism, what used to be called the Chicago Boys, if you're old enough to remember the Chicago Boys. You call it Chicagoan economics, but if you're Anglo-Saxons, that's a terribly hard word to say. So I'm not going to repeat Chicagoan economics more than twice. So that's one side of it. But David says its brother under the skin is a moral individualism that really blooms in the late 1960s and 70s, and it seems to stretch on this view from Marquand and the New Left through to the Romantic Revolt, which includes the women's lib movement, gay rights campaigners, civil rights campaigners in Northern Ireland, nationalists in Wales and Scotland. I guess the language movement in Wales would be another component of that. Now, I think that the idea that these are two, I think, very different groups are brothers under the skin, I think is problematic both analytically and programmatically. Indeed, it seems to me, David, that a lot of what you have to say in your critique is very similar to the New Left critique of the one-dimensional society, the culture industry, and so on, and so forth. But more than that, I think that to move forward, social democracy needs to recognise even more explicitly than it already has the way that post-materialist politics is a potential ally. And this isn't simply something that is an abstract point. David demands a proper conversation about the future of our society. Well, that is actually happening at the moment in one part of Britain. I don't know how many of you have been to Scotland in the last few months, but there's something profoundly interesting happening in Scotland, the like of which I've certainly never seen in my own political life, which is a conversation which is spanning church halls and, and the social media about the future nature of Scottish society. And in that context, we have your kind of social democratic concerns meeting kind of post-materialistic culture and leading to the kind of debates that you call for here. I was present at a seminar recently where one of the kind of key intellectuals associated with the British establishment, very close to David Cameron, I can't name him, it was one of those events where you're not supposed to name who was there, but he was saying how unfair it was that these Scottish nationalists were talking about what you do after independence. You know,
Unfair.
How dare they talk about a social democratic Scotland?
Yeah.
That was something to be decided after independence. The idea that these things could be joined together in a single conversation was unfair. That wasn't playing by the rules. Okay, that was this view of this profoundly influential figure in the British establishment. But this is the kind of conversation I think that you are calling for. So
Yes,
I think
it is.
to view
Absolutely.
these as our potential allies is maybe more interesting. So I think a more profound break with traditional social democracy may be in order there. And also in the area of geopolitics. Now, the traditional kind of lodestars of social democratic geopolitics are Europe and Atlanticism. These are the kind of traditional lodestars. And throughout the book, Europe is regarded as, I think, axiomatically progressive. The European Union is a force for good. Even German capitalism is better than its Anglo-Saxon competitor.
It is.
Now, much though it pains me to say this, I just don't buy this as an argument when the European Central Bank, aggressively encouraged by German politicians and economic leaders, is sacrificing the young people of Southern Europe and Ireland on the altar of an economic orthodoxy that's been upheld with a zealousness that would make even Margaret Hilda Thatcher blench. I'm afraid it's very difficult to see in these circumstances the EU as a bulwark supporting the public realm. Across much of our continent, it's actively undermining it. Now, the problem with this as an argument, and saying this in public, I see the looks of horror on faces around me in the room. It puts you on the side of the kinds of people that I certainly don't want to be on the side of. But
we know
the
who they are.
problem is that their critique of actually existing Europe seems to me in large part to be true, and if progressive intellectuals can't speak to power, then what precisely are they for? Atlanticism, very quickly. David has very little to say about Atlanticism beyond decrying the baleful cross-Atlantic influence of American ideas, or some American ideas. Yet it seems to me that any diagnosis of the state we're in, to cite Will Hutton, is incomplete if we don't account for the moral disaster that is the war on terror. Now, the actual strategic disaster of the war on terror has been underlined today. I don't know if you've noticed that ISIS, a group which Al-Qaeda considers to be too extreme, has just taken Iraq's second city today. So it's not going well, frankly, from that perspective. But just think of the moral dimensions of this. Britain, UK, is a fully committed partner in a network, a global network of torture camps. Britain is a fully committed, active participant in a programme of surveillance technology and practices which are a threat to a radical threat to democracy.
Yeah.
It seems to me that any future social democracy has to take the international more seriously, and that, you know, the nostrums of Europe and Atlanticism, you know, they don't cut it, frankly, anymore, even if they ever did. So this brings me kind of to David's prescriptions. David suggests, and again I quote, and again from the end of the book, the road to freedom runs through emotional engagement with our cultural inheritance and open-ended debate about its implications. Now again, this is something I'm very attracted to, but one of the interesting things for me, and maybe for other people in the audience listening to you, David, is who is the collective our in that sentence? This is very much a book about Britain, and of course it's one of the key strengths of the book. But Britain has changed radically, and there's a really interesting paradox about contemporary Britain. Viewed from the periphery, Britain post-1997 is hardly the same state. It's changed profoundly and radically. However, from the perspective of the central state, almost nothing has changed. So Whitehall, you know, the Welsh office is still there. Not sure what they do, but it's still there.
Is it really?
Yes, it's still there. The Scotland office, likewise. We still got the select committee. The central institutions of the state have not changed at all, and yet, you know, in Cardiff, in Scotland, in Belfast, there's been this profound change. And of course, David, given your proud connections with Wales, and, you know, to have the founder of Llais Llafur as one of your forebears, now that is, you know, what my kids would call cool. That is seriously cool. So you're well aware, of course, of the fact of and the importance of devolution. But what, one wonders, are the implications of devolution for the collective we? Okay?
Accept that.
And I'm not sure this is really explored in the book. However, I would also commend you to read. I'm David's literary agent today.
You're
I would
doing a
also
good job.
Suggest that you have a look at the latest issue of Prospect, where David has got a very interesting article arguing for a federal UK. A federation consisting of Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland and England. England, mind, not the regions of England,
I think it has to be England.
but England, yeah. And as someone who spent much of the past 3 years looking at data on English public attitudes, I think you're right. I happen to think that you're right. I also think it's hugely dangerous, as well as nonsensical, for progressives to abandon Englishness on the grounds that it's somehow inherently reactionary. But in embracing England, in addition to or alongside Britain as a policy, what does this mean, I wonder, for the arguments of the book? Should the rhetoric of English social democracy differ from that of the British equivalent? The historiography, the myths? It's clear to me, at least, and we have the former First Minister here with us tonight, it's clear to me that Welsh and Scottish social democracy are developing their own vernaculars, so to speak. Is not the same development necessary for England too? That's a question. Finally, and you'll be pleased to note finally, to unbridled capitalism. For me, one of the intellectual joys of the book is the engagement, actually, with Karl Marx. Wasn't really expecting that when I picked up the book. But of course, he remains the non-pareil analyst of capitalism in all its creativity as well as destructiveness. He is, above all, the thinker that understood the expansionism of capitalism. Not only geographically, territorially, but also the way that capitalism tries to commodify more and more and more of social life. And David is effusive in the book in his acknowledgement of Marx's, I think genius is not too strong a word. Indeed, the strapline of the book could well have been social democracy or barbarism. You know, something that Rosa Luxemburg would have applauded, of course. But David is a social democrat in the, we're going back to the kind of Marxian, post-Marx period, the Edward Bernstein kind of school of thought. So accept the analysis of capitalism that you find in Marx, but also believes that a new kind of politics based in an ethic of stewardship, which is a really interesting notion taken from Burke, actually, in the book. But this new kind of politics based in this ethic of stewardship can somehow tame or cage the beast. Okay? Now, many Marxists, of course, would think that that ultimately is impossible. Ameliorating capitalism is ultimately impossible. The problem, of course, is that Marxists have got nothing, and no credible alternative to put in its place. And their prescription is one that seems to me to lead to a defeatism. And David is no defeatist, okay, as will have been obvious in the passion of his introduction. So despite the rather depressing picture that you paint in the book, it seems to me that you've got this kind of Gramscian pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will in there. And that's why, even after reading what is in many ways a deeply depressing book, I felt kind of uplifted and a better human being for the experience. Well, starting from a low level. Anyway, so David, thank you so much for Mammon's Kingdom. It's a real achievement, an important statement, and all of the rest of you, can I just urge you, read this book. Thank you.
Great. Well, yes.
Fantastic.